I don't know anyone who doesn't help around the house who isn't fit for a home vacation. With full confidence, my mother-in-law stated this to me. Perhaps she expected me to apologize in tears. My husband, sitting next to my mother-in-law, smirked as if he was watching his little sister being scolded, observing my confusion. Seeing his attitude, I felt my emotions become surprisingly calm. "Then I'll leave," I replied, without the slightest hesitation. I didn't care what happened to them anymore. At that moment, everything became clear. I thought they should regret their actions. In my 42 years, I am Susan. I work full-time and, of course, fulfill my responsibilities as a homemaker. My husband John and I have two children. One is in college and the other is working. The kids have already moved out and are on their own, and John and I were supposed to enjoy our life together. But now we live with John, my mother-in-law, and me. After the kids left the nest, we started living with my mother-in-law, who lost her husband. The peaceful life I dreamed of with my husband has completely changed because of living with my mother-in-law. My job is demanding and I often work overtime. It is not uncommon for me to return home after 8 p.m. Lately, I often get frustrated with the environment that greets me when I return from work. The living room floor is cluttered with leftover snacks and discarded clothes. My husband is sprawled out on the couch watching TV and drinking beer, leaving the room a mess. Even when I get home, my husband doesn't bother to look at me. No dinner preparations have been made, and I can't help but sigh. Ignoring the trash scattered on the floor, I head to the kitchen as usual and quickly start cooking dinner. As soon as my mother-in-law realizes I'm back, she pops her head out of her room into the living room and begins her one-sided sermon directed at me. "What time do you think it is? I'm starving. You're not a man, but you're always talking about overtime, business trips, and not taking care of the house. You're a bad housewife." Using my late returns as a reason, she accuses me of neglecting household chores. She finds faults in every little thing that displeases her and blames me. In these situations, all I can do is leave her alone until she is satisfied. Arguing or getting defensive only makes the situation worse, so I pretend to ponder and focus on cooking. Her words sting my heart, but if I keep this up, she'll soon calm down and I can take it. However, there was something else that I found even more unbearable. It is the fact that my husband always seems to take pleasure in seeing me scolded by my mother-in-law. A wife should cherish her husband. "You have no charm," as my mother-in-law's stock phrases continue. "That's right, isn't it?" he would chime in, making a mockery of it all. I certainly feel anger boiling up towards my mother-in-law, but my husband's attitude irritates me the most. I ignore their words, warm up the side dishes, and serve rice for 3. Despite my repeated requests to finish dinner on their own when I'm late, these two never listen. Even when I start preparing the meal, they don't even bother to set the chopsticks. They just sit in their chairs, waiting for the food to be served on the table. I wonder if they see me as a maid who always follows their commands. Our current situation has deteriorated to this state, but before we started living with my mother-in-law, my husband often helped me out with housework. The fact that we managed to raise our 2 children while both of us were working is due to my husband's cooperation. When I was late coming home due to overtime, my husband would make dinner without a word, feed the kids, and get them finished with dinner. We've also split roles when it comes to cleaning and doing laundry. However, since we started living with my mother-in-law, my husband is like a different person. Suddenly, he stopped doing anything and started joining my mother-in-law in scolding me. Despite my bewilderment at this sudden change in my husband, my frustration and irritation are steadily building up. Of course, the cause is my mother-in-law as well. My mother-in-law labels me as an incompetent and lazy daughter-in-law, but in reality, she is just a freeloader. As for living expenses, we haven't received a single cent from her. After the death of her husband, my mother-in-law obtained a considerable amount of money from the inheritance. However, having never handled such a large sum before, she wasted it on buying expensive clothes and bags and showing off to her friends. Her wealth was quickly depleted, and she even accumulated debt, forcing her to sell her house. Then she rather forcibly moved into our home. "On the first day of living together, I'll be in your care from today." My mother-in-law bowed deeply and showed a modest attitude. However, just 3 days later, she began criticizing me for neglecting my housework. The sudden change in her attitude made me laugh at that time. However, the situation soon turned so serious that it was no laughing matter. She seems to imply that I'm inadequate as a wife because I'm too busy with my work. In addition to her complaints about housework, my mother-in-law also started criticizing my job. When we first started living together, I repeatedly explained to my mother-in-law that I was busy at work and often had to work overtime. There's a part-time job at a nearby supermarket for product display. You should just work there. Create a job where women have to work so much. Such were the only words that came back from my mother-in-law. She imposes her ideal image of a daughter-in-law on me and didn't even try to understand my work. Living with my mother-in-law was troublesome beyond belief. Whenever she didn't like something about our house rules, such as meals, she would complain. Until now, my husband and I had been eating simple breakfasts like bread and purchasing our lunches to eat as we please. Even about such things, my mother-in-law constantly complains. Nevertheless, after exhausting all explanations, my mother-in-law now reluctantly follows our house rules while grumbling. But dinner is different. Dinner is strictly at 6 p.m. There need to be at least 3 side dishes. The whole family should eat together. That's what a typical family is like. If you can't do that, you should quit your job. When it comes to dinner, my mother-in-law absolutely refuses to compromise and sticks to her guns. To begin with, my company's official hours end at 6 p.m. It's impossible to have dinner at home with everyone at 6 p.m. If I were to quit my job for that reason, our household budget would be in a dire state. Is it because your husband John's salary isn't enough? How terrible of a woman you are to shirk housework and blame your husband. Even when I explain that I work for the sake of our household finances, my mother-in-law is not convinced. Looking to my husband for help was a dead end. Mom, calm down. She's always been inefficient at various things. She'll get the hang of it eventually. Let's just forgive her for now. He doesn't defend me, only making irrelevant follow-ups. My husband seems to revel in the idea that he is an understanding, tolerant, and kind husband with a wife who can't handle housework. This attitude further irritates me. When we first started living together, my husband sided with my mother-in-law instead of me, and I was disappointed. After that, they both began to treat me harshly as if they were conspiring against me. If I try to get my husband to help with housework, my mother-in-law firmly stops it. Don't make John do housework. He is the breadwinner of the family. She dictates that it's the wife's job to do housework, raging and ordering. My husband doesn't attempt to stop her, nor does he try to protect me. Even though we used to live harmoniously as a couple without quarrels, at first I wondered why this was happening. But after seeing my husband smirking every time my mother-in-law yelled at me, I understood. My husband probably had a complex about the fact that I earned more than him. Truth be told, he didn't want to do the housework either, but he couldn't complain because there was a point in the household. I think he was just enjoying it all this time. When my mother-in-law moved in, she would reprimand me, saying, "Isn't John the head of the family?" Seeing me getting yelled at, he must have felt a sense of exhilaration. I was finally able to realize how narrow-minded my husband, who I had been with for so many years, was. After that, I had days filled with worry about what to do. My mother-in-law was still noisy, and my husband was unreliable. But remembering the quiet days before my mother-in-law arrived, I lacked the courage to make a decision. One day, on my way home from shopping, the lady next door called out to me, and an unexpected comment came out. "You should be a bit more considerate of your mother-in-law." I was surprised and asked what she meant. I can't say I like my mother-in-law, but I didn't think I was being that inconsiderate. The one receiving the terrible treatment is actually me. The lady next door revealed that she had heard about me from my mother-in-law. According to her story, I don't do any housework at all, and the house is dirty and cluttered. Laundry is piled up, my mother-in-law's chronic rheumatism has worsened, and she can't do housework because her body hurts and her son comes home late from work. I don't do anything even after seeing such a situation, so we only eat bread for every meal, and my mother-in-law has been crying and complaining about the situation. Indeed, I had not been receiving warm reactions from the people in the neighborhood recently. That's when I realized that the reason was the lie spread by my mother-in-law. My small, hunched mother-in-law is good at drawing sympathy from others. She's probably playing the role of a weak mother-in-law, who is enduring the terrible mother-in-law who doesn't do housework in front of the people in the neighborhood. The lady next door stared at me with cold accessory eyes. I felt so embarrassed to think that our family problems were spreading to the neighborhood. "That's not true." I made a vague reply and hurried back home. When I entered the living room, my mother-in-law was watching TV and eating snacks. "Please stop spreading irresponsible rumors." I said that with the momentum of rushing home. My mother-in-law laughed and apologetically said, "It's because it's true. I've reached my limit." I felt as if something snapped in my head. If she insists that it's the truth, then she can have it her way. With that thought, I abandoned all household chores from that day. The next day, when I came home from work, my mother-in-law was shouting as usual. "What's going on with dinner? Hurry up and get it ready!" My husband chimed in with my mother-in-law's words without even looking at me. Ignoring the two of them, I took out a cup of instant ramen noodle that I had stocked up and only poured hot water into my portion. Add my actions, my mother-in-law turned bright red and continued to scream. "I am the worst daughter-in-law who doesn't do any housework at all, right? I'm just acting as you said. What's the problem?" As I declared that and quietly slurped my instant noodles, my mother-in-law was unable to retort. She then went to my husband crying for help. Finally, when my husband came to me, I told him, "Mother has been telling the neighbors that I'm the worst daughter-in-law who doesn't do any housework at all." When I asked her to stop, she countered that it was true, so I've decided to stop doing housework. I'm going to do exactly what she has been spreading around. I let my husband hear the story from yesterday. My husband tried to soothe me with a troubled look on his face. "Mom just exaggerated the story a bit. Don't be so stubborn," he said. Even though his own wife was being bad-mouthed elsewhere and the cause was his own mother, he still sided with her. I didn't even feel like arguing. I threw the container of the finished cup noodles into the trash can, ignored my husband, and headed straight for the bathroom. I finished my laundry alone and took a bath. As I soaked in the bathtub, I felt refreshed, thinking I should have done this from the beginning. After all, whether I do housework or not, I'm always called a bad wife anyway. From then on, I did nothing at all. My mother-in-law made a fuss about the lack of breakfast bread. I had a day off from work. When I woke up and went to the living room, my mother-in-law ordered me to go buy bread immediately. "Why don't you go buy it yourself? I'm a bad wife, so I can only buy my own share. Also, from now on, either pay for your food or take care of it yourself." Ignoring my mother-in-law, I brewed coffee and, to cut my share of the bread from my bag, quickly finished my meal. Seeing this, my mother-in-law returned to her room without saying a word. I felt I might have been a little too mean, but considering what I have been through so far, this was the least I could do. Afterward, I tied up only my own space in a crowded living room and was quietly reading a book when the doorbell rang. When I looked at the monitor, there were clearly more than 5 elderly men and women on the screen. All of them were familiar faces. They were not just in a bad mood, they were clearly angry. While I was puzzled, my mother-in-law sprang out of her room and opened the front door. Then the elderly people lined up in front of the entrance came into our house one after another. I was stunned in surprise when an elderly man suddenly yelled at me. "I hear the wicked woman who doesn't even prepare meals for her own mother-in-law." These elderly people were my mother-in-law's siblings and their spouses. My mother-in-law had apparently told them a false story that she was being horribly treated by her daughter-in-law, not even being given proper meals, and not even being allowed to take a bath, and had asked for help. My mother-in-law is the youngest of 5 siblings, with 4 older brothers and sisters. Including their spouses, I was surrounded by 9 elderly people continuously being called a demon wife and deserving punishment. When you are criticized by this many people, cold sweat comes out of fear. "This is a misunderstanding," finally I managed to argue back with a trembling voice. At that moment, the eldest brother of my mother-in-law raised his voice. "Don't make excuses," and started banging the floor with a cane he was holding. The surrounded elderly people also joined in shouting, "Reflect on yourself, apologize." Then my husband, who had heard the commotion, showed up. In the flow of the conversation, my mother-in-law's brother began to question my husband. "Your wife's upbringing is terrible. I'm speechless. She doesn't listen to me at all. Her excuse is that she is busy with work. It's pretentious."
I'm in trouble too. Uncle, can you say a word to her as well? My husband, who raised himself above this, criticized me and tried to direct the point of attack that was directing at him back to me. He was only interested in his safety. He didn't care about me. Any side affection I had for my husband disappeared at this time. I thought my husband was a kind person until we started living together with my mother-in-law. He is not kind. He is just a weak person who cannot express his own opinion. A person who cannot resist the strong. One of my mother-in-law's brothers took my husband's words to heart and suggested that they should divorce such a wife. Everyone agreed. However, my mother-in-law said that they could give me one more chance if I intended to change my heart and serve my mother-in-law and husband in the future.
While holding back tears, my mother-in-law's siblings told me, "Be thankful. He won't find a kinder mother-in-law anywhere else." They said such a thing to me. Then the siblings decided they would take turns each week to check if I was doing the household chores and serving my mother-in-law and husband. Once the conversation was settled, everyone seemed satisfied. They said they were going to go out for sushi because they were all together for the first time in a while, and the elderly, my mother-in-law and husband, left the house. By the time we get back, the house cleaning and laundry should be done, right? My mother-in-law left me with the parting shot, looking pleased with herself. Why did it come to this? Alone in the living room, tears started to roll up. We were a happily married couple until we started living with my mother-in-law. Why do I have to be complained about by all the relatives despite the fact that I have been doing my best? Tears overflow. I'm filled with sadness, regret, and anger. After a few hours, my husband and mother-in-law returned home. I was sitting in the living room, which was still a mess. My mother-in-law looked at me in the messy room with a smirk, snickering, "Leave. We don't need a wife who doesn't do housework. I told you earlier to clean up, Gin and I." My mother-in-law, seemingly tipsy, perhaps from drinking, told me to leave immediately. Along with the order to leave, my husband joined in clamor, his face grinning. He probably thinks that if he does this, I'll surely start to obey him quietly. But I no longer had any desire to work hard for these people or any feelings of wanting to do something for them. Understood then. I leave. I promptly stood up and left the living room. Behind me, my mother-in-law and husband were laughing, saying I was bluffing, not caring anymore what would happen to these people. I packed my belongings in my room and left the house without showing my face to the two of them. About 2 weeks after leaving the house, I received a call from my mother-in-law. "John says he has no money, but what on earth does that mean?" To my mother-in-law, who seemed to have lost her calm, I told her the truth. "John's income is 1/3 of mine. I've been covering all living expenses with my salary up until now. Also, the house is under my name, so please leave soon. I'm going to put it up for sale." I urged my mother-in-law, who insisted it was a joke, to check the bank book in her drawer. On the other end of the phone, she made a sound, and finally fell silent. She seemed shocked by how low my husband's salary was. Then, as if a switch flipped over her, my mother-in-law started making a fuss, begging me to come back because she was sorry, and John was lonely. I had decided to divorce my husband. I told her I would have a lawyer handle things from now on and ignored her crying apology as I hung up the phone. Later, with a lawyer, I confronted my husband with a divorce. Recognizing the problems with my mother-in-law and husband's actions, the divorce was granted on the grounds that they were at fault. I was happily free and even got a small consolation payment. When I told the children about the divorce and what had happened, they sided with me, saying it was my husband and mother-in-law's fault. After that, I sold the house, and my husband and Madrino moved out. The two of them, having lost their home, temporarily stayed with relatives. As a result, my mother-in-law's lies were exposed, and it seems that my husband and mother-in-law were disowned by their relatives. I've heard they are now living in an apartment together, but with my husband's low salary, the places they can afford to rent are very limited. They are spending their time in a craft department, blaming each other for me leaving. I frequently receive messages from my husband asking for a reconciliation because he's cut ties with his mother, but I'm considering blocking him soon as it's becoming a nuisance. I've become unencumbered without the nagging of the two of them. I plan to live a graceful life from now on for myself.